hear us? Can you give some sign if you can hear us? Yes, okay, great.
Now.
So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to today's side event From Billions to Trillions to Impact. Lessons for the international development community on climate finance, which was organized jointly by the OECD, the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Benelux countries, and Dvlpt, the German Institute for Development Evaluation. We would also like to thank our host, the Benelux IAB Pavilion, for having us here today. My name is Alexandra Köngitter. I'm working as an evaluator at the German Institute for Development Evaluation, and I'm delighted to guide you today through this session. So, in the light of increasing efforts of the mobilization of climate finance for reaching the collective goal of $100 billion per year for climate action in developing countries, there's also the urgent need to better understand results of those efforts. And to do so, several countries and multilateral institutions have undertaken evaluations to see how climate finance efforts are translating in real impacts. And in this session we will present and discuss findings of climate finance evaluations and related key policy messages, and the presentations we're going to have today will explore the role of international development partners in effectively and efficiently supporting climate adaptation and mitigation. So we have a hybrid session today with first presentation virtually. So as an introduction, we will hear the key findings from a rapid review of bilateral climate finance evaluation from Megan Kennedy, head of the evaluation unit in the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. She's managing the DAC network on development evaluation, and she's currently leads also the work on evaluating blended finance and coordinates the COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition. So we have the presentation already displayed, and with this, Megan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, colleagues. It's lovely to be with you in this virtual setting. Thank you to the EIB Benelux Pavilion for hosting us, and to the colleagues from Germany and EBRD, from Dvlpt and the Evaluation Unit for being there in person. We wish we were with you today. As we've heard throughout the discussions of the COP, this is the COP of action. And that means that the focus in Egypt is on accountability for action. And we see that as one of the key roles of the OECD, to hold governments accountable for their actions on climate and for meeting the commitments that they have made. Within the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee Network on Development Evaluation, we work together to support independent and credible evaluations of international development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. And we work to draw lessons out of the evaluations that our members have conducted to provide insights to inform future actions and to make progress better together. And what you'll hear today is an example of one of those synthesis projects. Next slide, please. As these findings are still emerging and we're working on pulling together these key lessons, we would love to receive your feedback. You'll see our contact information, our website, and our Twitter account are available there on the screen. We would welcome your suggestions not only on the content of today's presentations, but also ideas or suggestions for future topics for syntheses. This rapid review was conducted by my colleague Mayanka Vij, who's here in the room with me, I think off camera. She looked at 7 bilateral evaluations, and these are looking at bilateral donors, climate finance evaluations specifically. And the reason we conducted this focused review on climate finance was to complement the work of our colleagues in the multilateral finance institutions and the development finance institutions, who had previously carried out a very comprehensive review of lessons, and those will be shared by our colleague from EBRD in a few moments. So what we found was really interesting, that despite the fact that there are challenges around data availability and comparability, we saw many common lessons emerging from this diverse evidence base across Germany, Belgium, Denmark, multilateral banks such as the EBRD, the African Development Bank, or the World Bank. So we wanted to pull these together and bring them to the attention of decision makers. And we count on all of you to help transmit these messages to your respective policymakers and decision makers in your own institutions. Next slide, please. I'll present just 5 key lessons from our work, and then the colleagues will have a chance to go into more detail and bring these findings to light. The first is about the needs to align with country needs and priorities to maximize the relevance of climate finance. And what we saw was that while there are in some cases examples of well-aligned allocations of climate adaptation or climate mitigation finance, on the whole, there are few examples of a robust climate risk analysis or country needs actually driving donor financial decisions. And so while we see that partners are increasingly using NDCs, nationally determined commitments, to channel their climate support, this could be improved. And that would help improve both the relevance and the potential impact of both adaptation and mitigation finances. We also see that partner countries need complementary support to strengthen their NDCs themselves and to make sure that the articulation of the needs and priorities is clear and goes beyond general objectives to provide more specific guidance. Next slide, please. We see here a tug of war, and we can imagine who you might think are on both sides of that tug of war. I like to think that some of it, that maybe on the right, is all of us people uniting to fight against the climate pollution and the climate crisis that's threatening all of us. And we see that oftentimes there's a need to be managing the potential, but also the perceived trade-offs between sustainable development goals, poverty reduction goals, and climate mitigation and adaptation goals. And that we must strategically use different financing channels to maximize the benefits across all of these objectives. So what we've seen within the OECD Development Assistance Committee is that many of our members are now prioritizing leaving no one behind, and they're also increasingly prioritizing climate-related goals. We saw that with the DAX declaration ahead of the previous COP in Scotland. And yet we see insufficient evidence still about whether the priority target groups, such as women and girls, refugees, or people with disabilities, are being sufficiently reached and effectively reached with climate finance through the channels where most of the climate finance is currently going. And that's a real concern, because we're not sure what trade-offs there may be between providing finance at scale, meaning providing large amounts of finance, and actually reaching those who are furthest behind and most in need of public support. So this is a key area where we need to drive attention. And we also need to look at the specific advantages of private finance mobilization strategies, which are currently being used more for mitigation in middle-income countries. Next slide. To this point, we see here an overemphasis on financial input targets. And while we, of course, do not want to deny the importance of meeting input finance targets, we also need to pay attention to relevance and impact. So we cannot have an exclusive focus on mobilization of dollars or euros or shillings. We also have to look at the inputs relative to the outputs that are achieved and whether those are reaching the furthest behind. So we need to be more carefully evaluating the additionality of mobilized private sector finance. That's not only the financial additionality, but also the development impacts and the additional development impacts that are achieved, which justify the use of public resources for climate finance. We also see that the global demand for adaptation is rising along with climate crises exponentially. And so we need to address, in order to address that, we will see new challenges emerging for current financing models. We are worried that an overemphasis on the financial input targets might lead to greenwashing and undermine our progress, our collective progress, by reducing the legitimacy and the credibility of climate efforts. And that's why we're excited to hear from you all today more about the impacts and where we should focus our efforts in terms of looking at effectiveness and results. Next slide. Many of the evaluations that we reviewed looked at inter- and intra-governmental coordinating mechanisms, and we found that these efforts were very useful, encouraging complementarity and with special attention to the value add of different parts of government, you can have greater efficiency and value for money. We did find, however, that cross-ministerial collaboration requires dedicated attention, political prioritization, and resources. We also see that there needs to be greater effort at complementarity in the external sense, coherence between different drivers, and in particular around aligning NDCs and the processes of monitoring and reporting on NDCs and the Sustainable Development Goals and national progress reports on those, especially at the country level. Next slide. Finally, we have seen that the approach to integrating climate finance into sustainable development cooperation has been primarily one of mainstreaming, but that doing so effectively requires a sharper and a more holistic approach, along with consistent leadership. We see here a roller coaster image, and that's portraying what we've seen in many countries, both donor countries and partner countries, where the political attention to climate at times rises and at times falls. And this fluctuation in political prioritization can undermine progress. So we need to, in order to effectively mainstream climate action into development cooperation, we need to have shared strategic guidance on climate. We need to go further than a simple do no harm analysis, and where possible, apply an explicit co-benefits lens that can increase the climate responsiveness of the entire ODA portfolio. And this is an area where we hope evaluators can do more to generate real solid evidence about realized co-benefits, not just the hypothetical co-benefits that we hear about. And finally, effective mainstreaming of climate into development cooperation requires a sharper focus on the climate-specific outcomes, and that needs to be carried throughout the project cycle, from program inception, design, implementation, and into monitoring and evaluation systems. Next slide. So with that, I will close, and thank you very much. Shukran. It's been a pleasure to be with you here, and I look forward to hearing from all of you afterwards. Please do stay tuned to our website to download the report when it's ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, for starting and for this excellent overview of the key findings and lessons from evaluation, which is a great start for the discussion we will have later on. But beforehand, I would like to dive deeper into the specific evaluations, and let us start with lessons on the overall policy architecture and relevance. And I would like to start with the evaluation findings from Belgium on the integration of climate change objectives into development cooperation and how is climate finance being incorporated. So another virtual welcome to our next speaker, Cecilia De Decker. She is a special evaluator of the Belgian Development Corporation since 2016 and supervises strategic evaluations such as the one of evaluation on the international climate finance, how is Belgium tackling the global climate challenges in vulnerable countries. And with this, Cecilia, over to you.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Megan, for the presentation. Of course, it resonates to us. I have Annemie van der Havoort sitting behind me. She's on the policy side. And as you said, Megan, we have to be on the action side, so I thought it was also important to have Annemie. And if you have a specific question on the current policy, Annemie is here to answer. So we carried out an evaluation of Belgium's international climate finance. So the evaluation was from 2013 to 2019. Of course, we had to take that period because we have to observe effects and results. But the evaluation was finished in September 21. So there are some observations from 20 and 21, but of course the situation has changed since then, and it was really a good collaboration that we had with our stakeholders, and the recommendations are taken seriously and followed by plans and action. I will come back on some issue on this. So maybe on the first slides, I will give some highlights of Belgian international climate finance. So if you can go to the first slide. Okay, thank you. I cannot really see it from here, but anyway, I see that's the first slide, so it's good. So Belgian international climate finance is focused on climate adaptation on the least developed countries, so the LDCs, and African continent. And the Belgian climate action, it's 97% ODA. So that means that it's development focus and mainly managed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also 20% from the region. 62% is bilateral program, and 38% multilateral climate-specific funds. But of course, these are the data 2013, 2019. This might have changed because, of course, in 20 and 21 there was a scale-up on the amounts that were committed by Belgium. So there is a wide range of sectors, but there are many projects promoting a climate resilient rural economy. And there is technical expertise from Ministry of Health and Environment on institutional strengthening of partner country climate-related institutions. On the next slide, we have two examples of projects. During the evaluation, there were two case studies, one in Senegal and one in Tanzania. And on this slide, you can see pictures with two examples of projects in Senegal. One is Paherba from Enable, and it was focused on irrigation perimeters and improve agricultural management. And the other one is a mitigation project, Ten Merina, which was supported by Bio with a loan. And this is one of the largest solar power plants in West Africa. I will come to the findings of this evaluation on the next slide. So the evaluation could have as result that there are significant results, but not in line with climate challenges. So there was a strong commitment at international level associated with a high level of expertise. But there is a need to strengthen resources and strategic guidance. There is a need to prioritize climate goals with respect to wider development objectives. And there is a need to define which development models are coherent with global climate-related objectives. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is currently working on a new strategic note, on guidance on these issues. We could observe many results in the field of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. For example, in climate adaptation, more sustainable water management, improved soil management, reforestation. These are examples of climate adaptation results, and mitigation results through renewable energy sources and efficient energy management. One of the results was also that it responds to the need of the partner and climate and their population, and through grants it can reach vulnerable people, vulnerable populations. So, and as I said before, though it is also the case with other countries, the impact is not in line with climate challenges. On the next slide, I will go to the key issue of this presentation is how we can further prioritize climate potential. There is an added value largely grounded in the general approach to development. It's really coherent for Belgium, that focus on adaptation and to tackle climate change and development cooperation as two sides of the same coin, and moving to decarbonize development transition, a just transition. So that's one issue. Another issue is that aside from Ministry of Environment, there was limited attention to partner country climate-related institutions, as mentioned by Megan, NDC, national adaptation plans, and this is something that is today. This is taken seriously in the project formulations. Then the project preparations. That's really an important moment to integrate climate-related issues. During the evaluation, we could see that environment, social, government assessments were done, but these are not granular enough. So that's also an improvement for today and the future. Then it was mentioned that it needs to be clarified what distinguishes specificities of climate action from more general environment action. It's of course a good thing that climate issues are seen in a environment action, but of course it needs to be focused what the objectives are. An important thing is territorial approach to climate portfolio design. It allows for a more systemic work, participation of local communities, and low carbon and resilient development models. And there is a portfolio approach, climate in the Sahel, with the Green Wall Initiative, and also on the civil society's organization, a joint strategic framework aiming social ecological resilience and improved well-being of communities. So the last slide is on the recommendation. I will not go into all the details, but of course one of the issues was to reinforce, to strengthen guidance, and that is drafting a new strategy, what the ministry which is working on. Then there will be also a knowledge platform to support this strategy with different actors, and also interministerial with an interministerial approach, but also between all development cooperation actors. The main recommendation is also to support mainstreaming efforts. That's the key issue, and mainstreaming is mandatory by law. So the actors, they have to do it. They have to do it, but of course the question is how to do it, and therefore the ministry supports university platform, CNIMOS, which has a toolkit to support different actors to integrate climate objectives in the development projects. So I will not go in other details in the recommendation, guidance, expertise, and of course the needs of partner countries are of course key issues, and working closely with institutions that oversee climate objectives in those countries is an important issue. And I will thank you for this session, and we are of course open for questions.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for bringing this into life and for sharing lessons from Belgium, from the evaluation, also the recommendations, and pointing out the topic of mainstreaming. I think there will be the discussion on that later on. But before we open virtual and on-site discussion, we will have another country experience or lessons from Germany, and this will be the drivers of allocation and aligning climate finance to national country priorities, identified by an adaptation and portfolio study from Dvlpt, and I would like to introduce my colleague, Martin Nolze, who is a senior evaluator at the German Institute for Development Evaluation, leading a comprehensive evaluation on climate change adaptation and being part of the Competence Center for Methodology. With this, Martin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and thanks everybody, the audience and our virtual colleagues, and of course the Pavilion for hosting this event. As Alexandra said, we, as Dvlpt, which is the official evaluation institute of the German government, with the mandate to evaluate all official development assistance by German Development Corporation, we worked on this multi-annual comprehensive evaluation, and we therefore welcome the OECD review of bilateral climate finance evaluation, and of course the inclusion of Dvlpt's evaluation results of Germany's adaptation finance in the time from 2011 until the year 2020. While, as Megan introduced in her first contribution, while being aware of the differences among the included evaluations with regard to data and also with regard to concepts and methodology, we are happy to hear and to learn about the consistency of findings across the different member countries of the OECD review. From the German perspectives, all lessons that were presented are highly relevant. First, and particularly in light of this broad German climate and adaptation portfolio, this includes the agony of allocation decisions between different channels and instruments with regard to relevance, but also with regard to effectiveness and impact towards climate resilience strengthening when it comes to one of the main international donors of climate finance in the OECD. Germany alone for adaptation was spending between 2011 and 2020 more than 17 billion euro on adaptation alone, and having more than 50 billion on climate finance in that period. Against the background of more than 10 years of finance and experience with climate change adaptation interventions, we have to accept that some instruments, for example climate risk insurances, are more relevant, for example, to target groups and partner countries than others. And we also have to accept that some interventions, for example nature-based solutions, are most effective with regard to adaptation objectives. And what are the main adaptation outcomes? It's dealing with shocks and stressors. It's enhancing the enabling environment, and it's also increasing the adaptive capacities. For dealing with shocks and stressors and increasing adaptive capacities, we found in an evidence gap mapping exercise together with the Green Climate Fund, the IEU, Independent Evaluation Unit of the fund, that there's a lot of evidence about the effectiveness on these two outcomes, but we have way less evidence on the effectiveness of the outcome enhancing the enabling environment. But on the other hand, we have a lot of finance, at least from the German side, but also from other donors, which goes exactly in this intervention type. So the question is how to optimize the available climate finance with regard to the needs, a topic that was already mentioned by our colleagues virtually, but also with regard to significant impact and with regard to measurable impact. Second point I would like to highlight is mainstreaming climate action is really the key, and I fully agree with the findings that we just heard from the Belgian cooperation. And to Dvlpt's understanding, we have evidence that is also about to go beyond the real market mitigation and adaptation interventions, and through the use of climate and environmental safeguards has to be introduced or has to be brought into the broader development cooperation landscape across sectors and projects and across ministries and national borders. And we would just like to highlight, when we were looking at the mainstreaming approach of German development cooperation, that we have the tools and concepts in place. It now comes to systematically and effectively and also efficiently use our environmental and climate safeguards and broader development cooperation. And against this background, we see it quite critically that mainstreaming is sometimes reduced to the project with significant climate objectives or principal climate objectives alone. And sometimes it's neglected that we have a broader development cooperation portfolio with huge potentials for climate mainstreaming, adaptation mainstreaming through our safeguard systems and using the systems and applying it as the concepts want the system to work. So third and my final point is why the general approach of German climate finance we found is demand and needs oriented. When it comes to empirical evidence, we still find room for improvement when it comes to allocating finance to climate vulnerability, providing higher commitments to the most vulnerable countries, especially the small islands development states, and also aligning sector priority with partner country priorities, as well as with donor coherence and complementarity. So we want to we fully agree on this lesson provided by the OECD review. In our evaluation, we found that climate vulnerability increases the probability of partner countries to receive German adaptation finance. But actually, we also found that the level of vulnerability is not necessarily increasing the amount of commitments. So while some countries face above average commitments, others face below average ones. And among those who receive below average commitments, there are some vulnerable countries, highly vulnerable countries, and small islands development states, and this holds both for bilateral and also for multilateral development cooperation. And we also found donor herding, meaning that there are some climate darlings with often high adaptive capacities, but we also have some climate orphans who receive below average commitments. So lastly, I would like to refer to the lesson by the OECD review that speed is the essence and transformational change is the key. Here also a strong agreement from the side of Dvlpt from the evaluation perspective on German adaptation finance again. We have strong support and empirical evidence. While transformative change has to unfold in order to keep pace, we still lack strategic orientation and conceptual frameworks that support project and program implementation when it comes to the dimensions of transformative change. And even though some pilots are already going ahead, from the side of Dvlpt, we call for a more systemic approach when it comes to transformative climate action, while we share the 5 action points of a recent high-level note from the Wilton Park Conference on promoting transformational change for sustainable futures. And the 5 action points include stop actions and policies that hurt the planet, create a shared vision and plan for a transformed world, support transformational change initiatives, guarantee open access and technology transfer, and create a global knowledge center. And with the global knowledge center, we could all build on existing initiatives, for example, from the Climate Investment Fund, the Transformational Change Learning Partnership, or the International Science Council, that could both be essential parts of the global knowledge center that we need for transformational change. And with this, I would stop my contribution here, and of course later I'm available for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for sharing the lessons and results from the evaluation of the German ODA. And before we move onwards to the tricky question on mobilization and private actors, for those who are following the event online through YouTube, I would like to stress that there will also be a Q&A function enabled, and we will see later on your question on this notebook. But hold on for a while, we'll come to this discussion after the next 2 presentations. So we move onwards to mobilization in the private sector, and let's start with lessons from evaluations in the Netherlands on leveraging ODA for private sector engagement. Our next speaker is Ferko Butner, a researcher at the Policy and Program Evaluation Department at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he evaluated the Dutch food security policy and is currently involved in the evaluation of the Dutch climate policy for developing countries. The first study on climate finance is about to be published. And yes, Ferko is jumping in on short notice for a colleague who's still in transitoria at the airport, I guess. Thank you for your prompt availability to jump in. So over to you.
Thank you, Alexandra. At the same time, you can start showing the slides. So my name is Ferko Butner. I work for IOB, the Independent Evaluation Organization in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we worked on the study together with my colleagues Marit van Zomeren and Pim de Beer. Next slide, please. So, yes, thanks. So this study about climate finance, it had various evaluation questions, but I'll pick out one, and that is about the additionality of ODA in public-private climate finance. And we look here at the bilateral Dutch climate finance, and for part that is public-private partnerships, often non-revolving funds, where you have a 50% subsidy. And part of it is more blended finance, that's often revolving funds in concessional soft loans. We're not looking at Dutch contribution to loans to governments, for example, through the World Bank or IFAD. I'll say something about the theory of this blended finance, about additionality, the evaluation question, then say something about the transfer from high to low concessionality, that was one of our findings. And finally, what is actually the niche for private finance in climate action? Next slide, please. So this is the theory, and I'll take a little bit of time for this to explain it. The idea is that public-private support is a temporary thing to move from more ODA to eventually commercial finance. And what you see here, if you go from left to right, is you start with mainly public funding for the development phase. Then you have combined public and commercial or private funding for a further improvement phase. And then on the right, in the blue, you see that's where the commercial finance takes over. And what are the characteristics of these three phases? The commercial viability on the left, it's not known yet, and there's no business case yet. And in the blended finance phase, you have the sort of on the left half, the non-revolving part, the business case shows perhaps some perspective, but there's not as many uncertainties. Whereas, the commercial sector steps in when the viability is clear, and it's now. And this happens in technology development, for example, when you have a technical concept development, that then later a more commercial concept development, and then in the end you have a viable proof of concept. Sometimes the technology is there, but the market is not there. And then you start with market study. Maybe in blended finance you have a sort of pilot, small, uncertain market, and then a commercial sector steps in when the market is certain. And the last line, that's for large-scale construction things. Think of large-scale solar panel field parks. You have a development phase, a construction phase that takes long, but there's no money coming in yet, and the operational phase when actually you start gaining some money. But the idea is that the blended finance is temporal and that you should move from left to right over time. Next slide, please. So we looked at additionality, and we looked at the DCED criteria and also the OECD guidelines about it. And we found three different situations. More on the left, you find the typically very innovative projects, a new product or a new market. There's no clear business case, it's risky, the private sector is not yet involved, or it's new in the country, and it scored quite well on the additionality criteria. It was convincing. More on the right, on the far right, these are the examples of nearly commercial upscaling. There is a clear business case, but purely commercial finance is not yet interested. So you have a sort of negotiation and check with commercial banks on what type of risks you can mitigate, restructure your funds. These examples also were quite convincing in their additionality, financial input additionality. But in between, there's a category of projects, and we found quite a few there, that they were not so convincing. They were not really innovative. There were similar initiatives already going on in the same country. Yet there was also not a clear business case, so the likelihood that it would move to the right was also limited. And there was no clear check whether there would be any commercial finance available. So we were not convinced about the additionality of those projects. Next slide, please. What we also found was that following this theory that successful initiatives should move from left to right, that works reasonably well on the right side. So those activities like blended finance investment in renewable energy, for example, that use revolving funds, they typically do move towards commercial finance because commercial banks or commercial investors are at the table from the start of this initiative. On the other hand, there are also interesting initiatives that start with subsidies and non-revolving funds. They rarely move to the right to concession, to, let's say, revolving funds. It was a bit disappointing. And there's a mismatch there. Let's say the subsidy programs rarely at the end of their project period have a clear business case, a bankable business case. And also the revolving funds, they have other entries for interesting initiatives than the successful ones from subsidy programs. There's also a mismatch in budget size. The larger DFIs, they look for budgets, investments of $1 million, whereas some of these successful subsidy programs, they look for much smaller budgets. And this is a criticism to our own ministry, we don't have a clear strategy to transfer successful initiatives from high concessional programs to low concessional funds. There are a few exceptions. That's Climate Investor 1 and the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, because they have 3 separate windows for these 3 phases. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, and that's our conclusion that private-public partnerships and blended finance are not the best solution for all sectors in all contexts. And if you look here on the left, you're more in the water sector, for example, protection from floods. There's hardly any interesting business case there, so that will remain just, it will require public funding. On the far right, in contrast, talking about solar energy in urban area, let's say Nairobi, there's really no longer need for public finance there. It can finance itself purely on a commercial basis. Of course, it depends a little bit on the sector and the country. And somewhere in the middle, for example, reduced deforestation from palm oil, for example, it will depend a little bit on the context. So there may be countries where it's very difficult. There's more ODA justified for innovations, and at some stage you want to reduce the amount of public funding in the blend. Yes, these were our main conclusions about mobilizing private finance. Thanks.
Thank you, Ferko, first of all, for jumping in virtually and then for sharing your lessons from your evaluation, pointing out to critical questions such as additionality, mismatches, and the differences different niches. And before we come to the discussion, I would now invite our last speaker in the last presentation, this time virtually, and it is on the role of the MDBs and IFIs as a catalyst and market transformers, lessons from a decade of evaluations from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And I would like to welcome with us Theo Sands, who is a principal evaluation manager within the independent evaluation department at the bank. And amongst other tasks, Theo focuses on evaluations which support more efficient decision making to advance the green transition and address the climate emergency. And with this, over to you, Theo.
Thank you, Alexandra. Is this working? It is working, fantastic. Thank you, Alexandra. And let me start by just taking a quick moment to thank the team at the German Institute for Development Evaluation, as well as to OECD for inviting me to participate here today. So we could go to the next slide very quickly. Just to introduce myself briefly, my name is Theo Sands, and I work within the Independent Evaluation Department of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. For those not familiar with the EBRD, we are a multilateral development bank set up with a unique mandate to support the private sector in the countries that we work in. And today we still are operating under that same mandate, but with an increased emphasis on green financing to address the climate emergency, having committed to full alignment with the Paris Agreement by end 2022, and a majority of financing being in direct support of the green economic transition by 2025. And within the evaluation team, our role is to try and independently assess the institutional performance of the EBRD, and through doing so, not only strengthen accountability, but also try and identify lessons and insights that empower evidence-based decision-making going forward. And today, I just want to give a small handful of some of those findings that pertain to how the EBRD and MDBs more widely can shape renewable energy markets to accelerate private sector investment. In case you're interested and want to find out more, all of our reports are public and published online at our website, including the piece that Megan mentioned before on synthesizing lessons from evaluations conducted by different MDBs on climate finance. So I want to start with a simple observation that underpins many of our findings on how MDBs, including the EBRD, can successfully engage private sector investment into renewable energy. And that is on the difference in the cost structure between traditional hydrocarbon power sources of generation and renewable energy generation. And this may sound like a slightly sort of glib or superficial thing to say. I don't think it'll come as a surprise to learn that you don't need to pay for the sun to shine or for the wind to blow in the same way that you have to pay for gas or for coal, which is what you can see represented by the orange segments of the pie chart on the right-hand side of the screen there. But the fact that renewable energy projects are almost entirely an upfront capex investment with no, almost negligible variable ongoing costs means that investors have very little ability to mitigate risk through influencing variable costs going forward. And what that means is that we need to be in a position to provide investors with a policy environment where they have a revenue model that reflects that fixed cost structure, that provides them with a level of revenue stability that they're willing to make that large upfront cost investment in the first place. And we've seen in the EBRD where we have supported ongoing policy dialogue efforts to strengthen the revenue stability and provide this revenue model for investors, private sector investment has swiftly followed. And we saw this most recently in our evaluation of the EBRD solar investments. And actually the situation here in Egypt provided a great case study of that, where the initial feed-in tariff that the Egyptian government launched for solar back in 2014 had unfortunately not great uptake due to private sector investor concerns over contract enforceability. And the EBRD, in combination with other MDBs, worked very closely with the Egyptian government in a long policy dialogue process to strengthen the energy off-taker contractual arrangement and to provide investors with that solidity and robustness and stability that they needed in order to make that large upfront investment in the first place. And consequently, under the second round of the feed-in tariff, even though the tariff was much lower, the price that energy generators were receiving for their energy was much lower because they were much less concerned about the contract security, because they had a much clearer idea about the level of revenue stability. There was much better uptake, with over 30 projects reaching financial close, providing a combined total of, I think, close to 1.4 gigawatts of renewable energy. And the other sort of, key consequence from this high upfront, high investment cost of renewable energy projects is the importance that means of the initial cost of capital. This is what I've tried to demonstrate on this graph here, which shows the cost of energy for different types of energy as a function of the discount rate. And so what this is saying is at the bottom line here, for a typical gas power plant, raising the discount rate from 0 to 15% increases the lifetime cost of energy produced by that plant by 25%. Doing that same exercise for a solar power plant increases it by 300%. So the leverage that the cost of capital has over the feasibility and affordability of renewable energy projects compared to traditional hydrocarbon, it's a completely different ballpark, a different dimension. And so then the question is, what does that mean for us in multilateral development banks? What implications does that have for us? And the first, I think, is relatively obvious: continue providing financing. And in the countries where the EBRD operates, where recently we have seen the cost competitiveness of renewable energy, this is in part, obviously, due to the massive advances made in renewable energy technology, particularly in solar, but it is also due to the availability of financing from MDBs at concessional and commercial rates, which have enabled that low cost in the first place. But I mean, clearly, given the financing deficit that was mentioned earlier, and given the importance of the cost of capital, it's not merely enough for us to be providing our own finance. We also have a role to play in order to continue supporting commercial banks to finance private sector developers as well. And this was something that was picked up in the synthesis piece that Megan mentioned earlier, which collates lessons from different evaluations conducted by MDBs on climate finance, the importance of the role of MDBs in providing commercial banks with the technical assistance and support that they need to start climate financing effectively and to address the informational asymmetries that they face in that area. And there is some evidence that this is starting to have an effect. There was an Inter-American Development Bank evaluation which highlighted that commercial banks were valuing the support they were receiving from the Inter-American Development Bank in conducting appraisals of green project finance, but I think also it's an area of growth for us too. And the final thing that I'd highlight in terms of what we can be doing, amongst many other potential mechanisms, is addressing the policy barriers and regulatory barriers that commercial banks often face in providing finance for renewable energy projects. And this was something that we observed time and time again on our cluster evaluation of the EBRD's solar project investments. That in the countries where we were operating, commercial banks faced regulatory prohibitions on investing in solar projects that effectively made it incredibly expensive, onerous, burdensome, and not really worth it for either the financial institution nor the private sector developer of the solar power plant in the first place. And one of the recommendations from our study that came out of that was for the EBRD to not only focus on strengthening the investment environment for renewable energy for private sector developers, but also to focus on the constraints that stop commercial banks from being able to affordably supply renewable energy, given the constraints that we observed and the importance of the cost of capital in the affordability and feasibility of these projects in the first place. So I'm just wanting to emphasize one final thing, and then I'll stop talking and we can get into the more interesting questions and panel discussion. And that's the continuing role of MDBs in making the challenging systemic investments, which in the longer term can unleash private sector investment. And there's plenty of different potential examples that one could potentially draw on here, but I'm going to focus on three. And the first, I think, is the most clear, and that's investing into national grid infrastructure. And where we've seen MDBs investing in national grid infrastructure and upgrading national grid capacity in order to support the integration of intermittent renewable energy, we have subsequently seen private sector investment into renewable energy power plants. There is a sort of causal connection there, that if we make that difficult first, sometimes more challenging investment, then the private sector investments will follow. The second area where I think we'll see a lot of sort of interest in a lot of projects going forward is energy storage. And here there is clearly, it's a slightly different ball game, because here there's a huge amount of technological and business model innovation going on. And this will require some form of de-risking via blended finance or via the mechanisms that my previous colleague was suggesting. But we're going to need to be there to support it, to make those initial, difficult, challenging investments in order to demonstrate that these can reach commercial viability. And the final area where I think we really need to be playing a big role, and where the EBRD is starting to initiate a lot of projects, is in the decommissioning of traditional hydrocarbon power plants. And by doing decommissioning, by financing decommissioning, we not only create capacity for more private sector-led renewable energy generation, we can also be supporting a just transition through making sure that affected employees have the skills and capacity to enter the new green economy. And actually, I was delighted to see that just earlier today there was an initiative launched under which the EBRD is leading an energy pillar in partnership with the Egyptian government, which plans to decommission 5 gigawatts of hydrocarbon power by 2025. So that's the type of thing that we're starting to see more of, and which we can see making a big difference in terms of private sector investment from the evaluations that we've conducted. As I mentioned at the beginning, all of our reports are published online, available via the website or via the QR code on the screen now. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
So thank you very much for sharing your lessons and also the challenges of the MDBs. And with this, we had our last presentation, and we are now open for discussion. We have some 40-something participants online, and you can also engage in the discussion via the Q&A function, which is now enabled. So please find the chat to post your questions. I will watch for them here. And in the meantime, also in the audience, you're very welcome to address your questions on site, if you wish so, and then we will address them. Would it be possible to come?
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm Belgium. I'm a PhD researcher in climate policy in Africa, also focusing on North-South relations and climate finance at this COP. I had a few questions actually. The first one was for Megan. I was just wondering, since you compared different countries' climate finance, I was wondering if in their projects you saw a lot of overlap, because in development cooperation, this is something that we're talking often about, that there's between countries, they're all, often doing this, taking the same initiatives in the same places, which is not very additional. So I was wondering about that. Then I had a question for the Belgian presentation. You stated that, I think you stated it as maybe an issue to solve, that there was limited attention to the partner country institutions. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that. And then last question for the presentation on Germany. You talked about climate darlings and orphans, and I was wondering which countries these are. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. So let's start. Megan, over to you, please.
Yes, great. Thank you for that question, and we'll be interested to hear more about your research. That sounds really interesting, Charlotte. Manka, please feel free to jump in if you have complementary information. But in our work, I think what we see is that there is a lot of donor crowding. So we can see donors are concentrated in the same sectors in the same countries. Now, how do we actually assess whether that is representative of duplication, or rather those are high-need country sectors, and so they're supporting complementary projects, for example. I think Theo mentioned the example of supporting, energy sector reform. You have grid reform, so you have all sorts of different things that could be financed within the energy sector. It's an extremely broad sector. So I don't think we would be able to really give you good information of the whether those risks of overlap and lack of additionality are actually playing out at the project level. I think there is evaluative evidence that would look more specifically at evaluated projects, but the work that we did is more at the aggregate level, so I don't think we could really judge, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. I hope this answered your question. So we had the question for Cecilia on the limited attention on the partner countries. Please, Cecilia, over to you.
Yes. Thank you for the current question, and I'm happy to elaborate on this issue. During the period that was evaluated, we noticed that climate was sometimes a secondary issue. So that means that there was alignment with a partner country institution in the field of agriculture, for example, health and whatever, on development sectors, but not with the climate-related institutions. So, for example, you will have agricultural or rural development project, which is aligned to the Ministry of Agriculture, but not enough aligned to the partner countries' institution relating to climate. There was an initiative by the Ministry of Environment, the Belgian Ministry of Environment, who supports the climate institution in partner countries. But these findings relates more to the development projects. And this is something which is taken seriously into account, that now in the enable, so the bilateral governmental cooperation, they should involve partner countries related to climate, on climate issues. So I don't know if Annemie, you would like to add something on that?
Yes, I think what was also meant by that finding of the evaluation team is that there was not enough alignment or cooperation with ministries responsible for climate policies, but that there was not enough taken into account plans and policies in general. And so what we are doing now is that aside from specific climate action and projects, we are also supporting our partner countries in enhancing ambition and development of their NDCs, of their nationally determined contributions and other plans, and we are doing that amongst other partnerships through the NDC partnership. We are supporting it through the NDC Partnership Action Fund, and so we we are trying to support our partner countries in making those plans also not only more ambitious, but also making them more more fit for purpose and more implementable. So that's a thing I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was helpful. So the last question for Martin for the detail on the portfolio and allocation analysis, please. You have a microphone.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking about the 8 darlings and the 8 orphans in the climate finance landscape of German development cooperation. So in our allocation analysis, our first finding was, as I said, that Germany is actually allocating more funding to vulnerable countries. So this was at the positive point on the relevant side. And then we looked deeper and then found, well, with increasing vulnerability status, some countries, especially vulnerable countries and small island development states, are receiving less than expected, or less average than expected funding based on their vulnerability status. And we looked at other determinants and found that when we have 2 countries with the same vulnerability status, then Germany invests into the country where more other donors are around. So, and I don't want to expose single countries now. We have a map about this allocation patterns in our evaluation report, but it was that there were vulnerable countries and of course small island development states which benefit less from a higher number of donors in general. We expected that, well, looking at this financial allocation patterns, we expect that those countries maybe benefit more from multilateral engagement. So we just recently did an analysis of the multilateral portfolio and looked about the contributions, the core contributions and the project bound funding from Germany to multilaterals, and also there we didn't find evidence that small island development states benefit an amount than expected based on their vulnerability status and on their status to be small island development states, because it's a German strategy actually to commit more funding to SIDS and vulnerable countries. So yeah, so this was the story at the glance, but yeah, without wanting to expose single countries here. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. I was wondering where the camera was. Is it here? Ah, okay, to say hi. Ah, this one, to say hi. I was just wanting to answer to you, because what you were saying seems like typical donor behavior, if we can call it like this, that often the darlings are not maybe those who are in most severe need. But at the same time, for my research, I have traveled in West Africa, and I've heard there from policymakers that for them, they are shifting towards bilateral aid increasingly because the multilateral funds are very difficult to access. So if it's maybe for the vulnerable countries, because I didn't interview vulnerable countries or SIDS, it's maybe different because of this particular status, but I feel like the trend that I have been observing is going the other way around, that the most vulnerable have maybe more, I mean, just in general, the countries have a lot of difficulties with multilateral funds. Yeah,
exactly. And another determinant that was, or that turned out to be significant in our regression analysis was actually the adaptive capacities of the country. So most donors provide funding to those countries with the highest adaptive capacities, which actually is, I think, confirmed by studies from the Green Climate Fund and so to invest more in readiness programs, bring more assistance to make them capable to apply for funding, but also, of course, to cope with incoming funding and to allocate these resources to the target groups that are most in need. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So for those attending online, still the option to use the chat function and to engage in the discussion. And I would have one question for Ferk. cool on how would you assure maximum additionality of your limited ODA support?
Thanks, Alexandra. Yeah, I remember Marit and I, we were discussing this, and we thought for future climate finance, because aligning all other policies to climate objectives is so important, and that seems to come a bit later after, let's say, climate finance and ODA, we thought, what if we would reverse this? What if we would first align all Dutch or European policies to climate ambitions, then see what is left and what we can do with our ODA by climate mainstreaming ODA in agriculture, in water management, and then perhaps there are some smaller gaps left that really need dedicated climate finance. So this is sort of a reverse phases as what seems to be currently happening in the Netherlands.
Okay, and perhaps another question on the discussions on losses and damage ongoing right now also here in Egypt, and how they might affect climate finance. Perhaps Ferko, or if anyone else at the panel want to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, I would like to respond. Okay, this is more my personal opinion. It's not like this, the position of the Dutch government currently. I'm quite happy with the discussion on loss and damage, because I think it will encourage much more than the situation is now, to invest in things now, climate adaptation, for example, mitigation as well, to avoid much higher costs later on. We all know that it is economically wise to invest now rather than later, but if we feel responsible for the financial damage later, then it will encourage us much more, I hope. But I'm curious what the other thinks about that.
Okay, thank you. There are two prompt reactions. Theo, perhaps you want to elaborate more?
I can jump in. I think that's a really interesting point, that by having that mechanism in place, you're creating incentives for climate adaptation that don't otherwise exist. And we sort of struggle with this as an institution because we operate under a sound banking mandate, a sound banking principle, which means that we are meant to be providing finance to projects which have the capacity to pay us back through some mechanism. And having a loss and damages scheme set up could be such a way that it would enable more provision of financing to climate adaptation on a sound banking basis by providing a means by which finance can be returned to lenders ultimately.
Thank you. Martin, any further ideas?
Yeah, maybe just to add on this, at Dvlpt we had a whole module of our multi-module evaluation on residual climate risk management. A huge portfolio, a growing portfolio, or a growing part of the portfolio of the German adaptation finance development cooperation portfolio. And this includes actually different instruments, and we realized from our allocation analysis under relevance that, for example, climate risk insurances are of high relevance for target groups. But when we look deeper into the different instruments, including risk preparedness, other risk financing instruments, and transformative risk management, we found from community-based surveys and interviews that actually there is interest in climate risk insurance, but it's not the only and the most dominant one. When you look at it as a single instrument, we rather found demand for a more comprehensive risk management offer by development cooperation, including the different instruments, including risk preparedness schemes for the reduction of loss and damages or impacts through greater readiness. Of course, different risk financing instruments are relevant for target groups and partner countries. And again, or more increasingly also transformative risk management strategies like climate-induced migration schemes, where we see more and more relevance, but it's so far, at least for German development cooperation, a neglected instrument or a neglected topic. We have only a few approaches in place, but not at a large scale, and only some pilots. So this is definitely something where I think we have to invest in more knowledge generation and providing this knowledge about transformative risk management strategies for development cooperation and other donors.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much. I'm looking for further reactions. I think we're fine here. Mainstreaming was a topic pointed out by several speakers, also by the rapid review, impact by mainstreaming. Any further ideas how to strengthen mainstreaming and thereby climate resilience to our panelists? I don't know who would like to elaborate on that.
I think I can comment just from my perspective on one mechanism which has trade-offs, which is having targets for projects with a green component. And I think that, you know, there is a risk, as Megan mentioned in her review, that by having targets, you start to have some kind of increased capacity for greenwashing or so on and so forth. But at the same time, you know, we've seen in the EBRD, we have targets for the amount of financing in support of the green economic transition, and that has been a hugely powerful incentive internally to make sure that now at the forefront of every single project is, can we mainstream climate and green considerations into this?
Well, I could come in on that question, Alexandra. Thank you. I think that's a really good point, Theo, about the incentive structure that's created. And I think two thoughts from our review. One would be to bring the discussion of potential trade-offs or perceived trade-offs down to a much more specific level. So I think one of the challenges with mainstreaming, and we've learned this already on gender equality mainstream, for example, is that when you have what they, you know, in gender, they used to talk about gender having been mainstreamed to death. So it kind of just gets very thinly applied and spread all across a portfolio, but not in a particularly meaningful way. So I think you have to really balance those two, of having clear prioritization, but then bringing it down to a much more concrete and operational level, which also might mean accepting that certain parts of the portfolio aren't going to have a very strong climate emphasis, and that's okay. They have other objectives that are clearly defined, that are at least aligned with our climate objectives, but we're not going to kind of overemphasize those, but then really zero in on those areas where there is the greatest potential for synergies, and really get much more specific about which climate objectives. And I think it's also to really counter these very counterproductive narratives about there being real trade-offs, because I think what we're seeing increasingly is that those trade-offs are a false narrative that are actually undermining progress, and they're not based in evidence about what's actually reducing poverty, what's actually increasing equality, or reaching the furthest behind at the same time as supporting the green transition. Thanks.
Hi. I can also comment on that. I really liked what Megan said about having also projects in your portfolio that don't have an emphasis on climate and environment. I think that's a very important point. I think we want to build our strategy on 3 pillars. We have climate-specific action, and I think this is also necessary to build experience in your own institutions, among your actors you are working with, and to have that experience that then can help to improve the quality of mainstreaming throughout the portfolio. But then again, the third pillar for us is, besides those specific actions and mainstreaming, is policy coherence. And so that's I think that really points to what Megan was saying, that the entirety of your portfolio has to be aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement and of the goals of the climate policies in your partner countries. But of course, there are also other very important priorities in development cooperation and poverty eradication that don't need to be put aside. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it resonates what Megan said about being specific, and I would like to add also the guidance on which development models, and that you can define it in each sector, in agricultural sector, in energy sector, what types of agricultural models should be supported to be resilient to climate change, and to also to fight climate change. So in each sector we can define this development model and articulate climate change efforts and development.
Okay, thank you. Just for the audience, any further questions in the chat we are fine. No further comments, additions. So with this, thank you very much to our virtual panelists and on-site speakers for the great discussion, for the presentation on the rapid review, on the evaluations, and from the experiences from the Netherlands, from the German allocation portfolio study, Belgium, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And I hope you enjoyed the session. Thanks also for the virtual presentation, and for the next 1.5 weeks, a good continued discussion on the conference in Egypt and online. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.